Welcome to my fourth video in this range of how to play the London system, which is quite appropriate because I live quite near London, so I guess I should be good at this opening. And in this video, we're going to have a look at Magnus Carlsen, world champion Magnus Carlsen, using the London system from a tournament, the Weekend Z tournament, to defeat the very strong player Tomaszewski. And this was a very good game, and it showed some brilliant understanding in the middle game. Rather than concentrate on the opening, we're going to sort of see some very nice positional play from Magnus. And in actual fact, this is my top positional game, my favorite positional game from 2016. And I'll explain why. But let's move, first of all, into the 12th after move 12, when Magnus has just played rook to d1. And here, very interesting, Black now played knight to g6. And we're going to see now two exchanges which I just think are amazing. They're exchanges I wouldn't consider, and it just shows how positionally strong Magnus is. Now, in this kind of normal position, nothing's been exchanged yet. Magnus showed a very deep understanding of the position, and he understood here that Black's worst minor piece is this bishop on b7. And this is just something I want to show everyone. This bishop is bad because it's stuck in behind the pawn on d5. It's a very bad piece. And now Magnus goes into some exchanges to amplify how bad this piece is. And he now plays bishop takes g6. And this is a very unusual idea, giving up that bishop, which is generally a good piece. But all he's trying to do is exchange off Black's two best, most active minor pieces, which was the knight there attacking the bishop. And after Black recaptures, he now exchanges off the other most active minor piece, the bishop on d6. And here, the point behind his whole plan is he can plonk his knight upon the e5 square, and he's aiming to play against the bad bishop on b7. And I just really like the small exchanges that Magnus played here. And he plays tactically brilliant in a second or two. But for premium members, we'll have a look how this position was built up. And this is premium members on chess.com, subscribers. And we'll have a look at the end of this game. But just for those of you who jumped in for this little segment, those two exchanges, I think, is really one of the main things about this video. And it should be something you all bear in mind. Look for exchanges that help you, and try to leave your opponent with his worst minor piece. So exchange off minor pieces to leave your opponent with the worst minor piece. In this game, it's the bishop on b7. But okay, let's now go back to the start for those users, the members of chess.com, subscribers. And the game starts as a London system. So Tomaszewski plays knight to s6. I'm recommending you go bishop to f4 here in the London system. But after knight to f3, the position quickly becomes the same, e6, and now we play bishop to f4. So if you've seen, again, the previous videos in this series, you'll know all about what ideas you should be playing. And here, Black plays b6. And this is a Queen's Indian setup, or should we say also an opening which Nimzo Indian players would like to play, this kind of way of playing with b6. And it's really, I think, the London system, a great opening against this. Black can quickly go wrong, and he can quickly lose track of what he should be doing. So what do? Well, we finish creating our pyramid. So Magnus plays e3. Bishop b7 is now played. And here, a typical Magnus move. I don't necessarily think the next move is needed. You don't need to play this as white. But Magnus in this game goes for a positional squeeze. So it's not as tactical as some of the other games we've seen, but maybe it will suit your style. And one idea Black often has in these positions is to play knight to h5, trying to gain the bishop on f4. Now, I'm not necessarily certain this is a major threat, and I've just played knight to d2 in this position on a number of games I've had. And this is quite a tricky move because, okay, I want to finish my normal setup given a chance. And at some point, Black has to decide whether to go d5 or c5. Now, If black plays d5, we're back into the previous videos we've looked at in this series. And if he plays c5 here, I consider this a slight mistake because of knight d2. How can white take advantage of this c5 move? Well, knight to c4 can lead to a very problematic position for black. That knight is aiming to come into d6, and if d5, knight to e5 leaves white with a fantastic position. There's a threat of moving the other knight to g5, just winning the pawn on f7. There's also ideas of bishop to b5 check. So this opening, black really at some point has to go d5 or c5, and then we're really back on what we know from the previous videos. But let's see Magnus's approach here. He just goes h3, and the idea is allowing the bishop to tuck itself away upon the h2 square if black ever plays knight to h5. So Magnus has a lot of respect for his bishops in the early stage of the game, and he wants to just tuck his bishop here if black attacks it. So the game continued with normal development, bishop e7, bishop d3, and again, this goes with what we've looked at earlier on in our videos on this. Both sides castled. If you're going to play h3 as white, you generally want to go for a more positional approach. You're not going for a crazy attack as we've seen previously. You'll go for a normal positional approach. So white simply castled. Now black played c5. We don't have any knight c4 moves, which is often a good way of meeting c5 if we can play that, trying to get our knight into d6 as we've just seen. But here Magnus just finished his triangle, finished his pyramid, played c3. Black developed his last piece, knight to c6, and now knight to d2. And again, this is what we've seen in the other videos. All the white pieces have got to their normal squares, and now white can consider what to do. Normally in this type of structure, I'd be trying to go e4 or knight to e5, as we've seen. Black decides he needs to do something in the middle, so he plays d5. And now we see a very, I think, clever play from Magnus. Rather than trying to force the issue here by playing a move such as knight to e5 here, he takes a very mature outlook on the position. He basically thinks, what can my opponent do? And he comes to the conclusion that black's not really threatening anything dangerous. If black ever pushes the pawn with c4, this is normally a mistake because black can no longer have a little bit of pressure on the d4 pawn, and black can't really improve the position of his pieces so much. So Magnus, realizing that his opponent can't do a great deal, decides, I'm going to take my time and improve my pieces. So in order to improve white's pieces, what should white do? Well, first of all, white places his queen on a good central square, and he does an idea which is called connecting the rooks. This means both rooks can now come into the game on some better square. And maybe e4 is an option later on. Black decides to play bishop to d6, thinking exchanges may help his position. And now Magnus just plays rook to e1. Very subtle, bringing both the rooks to the middle of the board. And this is another idea that we haven't seen yet. And this is an idea where you're allowing black to take on f4 if you so wish. In the game, black decided to play knight to e7, a very standard maneuver. If black had captured on f4, what was Magnus's idea? Well, he would have taken with his e-pawn, and he has this pressure on the half open e line. Yes, he does have double pawns, but sometimes double pawns can be a strength. And this is one of those cases. This pawn gives extra control of the key e5 square. As we've already mentioned, the e file is open. And in general, this just seems to help white, this double pawn. And remember what we said at the start. This bishop on b7 is such a bad piece as long as we keep the top of our pyramid here, because we don't want to allow black's d pawn to come forwards, because if that pawn ever did come forwards, the bishop has a much greater range. So Tomaszewski decided, okay, I'm just going to move my knight to a better square. So he goes knight e7, and again, great patience by Magnus, an idea we saw Kamsky use, but Magnus was the first player to do this. Rook a d1. And this is awaiting an opening on the d file. So at some point, this d file will open up when the rook will be on a great position. One thing my dad told me when I was playing chess, he was really my only coach. He was a good chess player. And he said, Simon, you can never go wrong by positioning your rook opposite your enemy's queen, because somehow later on, when exchanges happen, this is always going to benefit you. And I remember that rule, and that's true here. And now Tomaszewski played knight to g6. And here we see this, in my eyes, brilliant positional exchanges. And we're going to see how these exchanges really help Magnus's position, because I, for one, would not be eager to swap off this bishop of mine. It looks like a great piece, the d3 bishop. But Magnus has this great understanding of the position, and he realizes that later on, the more exchanges he makes, the worse this bishop on b7 will become. And this is really such a great positional game. And this is a little tip we should all learn from. Let's always try to work out which of our opponent's minor pieces is his worst piece. And here we can see it's the bishop on b7, because it is stuck behind this pawn. It's blocked in. I mean, let's say, for example, the bishop on f4, we could place that back on c1. You could then see, let's imagine that bishop being placed back on the c1 square, just how bad that bishop would be. That bishop would be trapped behind your pawns, your white pawns. And it's the same for the bishop on b7. So Magnus realizes this, and this is something we should do. Look at our opponent's worst pieces, and he simply makes exchanges to pinpoint the enemy's worst pieces. So he exchanges on g6. He exchanges on d6. He takes the e5 square, and he's figuring, well, my knights are going to be better than your minor pieces. And here black plays, I would say, a rather ambitious move. I think white's plan, if black doesn't do anything, will be to expand with f4. And then later on, maybe even to start an attack with g4, because we have a closed position. And when the pawn structure is locked, it's okay to push pawns in front of your king. But as a rule, you should never push pawns in front of your king if it's an open position. If that bishop had greater range, I wouldn't want to play g4. My king would become too weak. But as the bishop is locked, I can play that move. If I was black here, I would have played a move like a5, trying to bring the bishop to a better diagonal on a6. But Tomaszewski played g5, trying to stop f4. And now f4 anyway. Magnus switches from positional play to tactical play. Black takes on f4. And here I think any normal mortal would go pawn takes pawn. But Magnus plays very ingeniously with rook to f1. And the point of this is he wants to take with a rook on f4, figuring his rook will have a much greater range on the f-file. It will put pressure on black's king. But of course, this does involve a sacrifice, which black declined. Black played knight d7 in the game. If black had taken on e3, let's have a quick look at some possible variations. I think Magnus would just take with a queen back. And here he's got great compensation. And again, this is a sign of a very strong player, being able to move from positional play straight into tactical play. And there's ideas now of playing some sacrifice on f6 at the correct time, opening up the king. Black would have to play g takes, then maybe queen at g3 check. You've also got ideas of queen g3 first, threatening rook takes f6. And other ideas just include doubling on the f-file when the f7 pawn will be a major weakness. So this is clearly compensation. I mean, maybe Tomaszewski should have gone for this anyway, because there's a little rule. If your position's bad, well, you might as well take a risk and be a pawn up with a bad position. In the game, Tomaszewski played knight d7. And now Magnus played queen to h5, another excellent move, controlling the knight. And he wants to just move a pawn to e5. And again, this is a typical idea in the London system. Try to get a pawn to e5. Always take with a pawn on e5. If black takes on e3 here, well, knight takes f7 would be disastrous for black. So Tomaszewski tries to repeat the position, but Magnus places queen on a more aggressive square. And now, if black takes on e3, there's certainly ideas of rook takes f6, and queen takes f6 with at least a draw, but a lot more, I'd imagine. Queen d8 played, trying to control the f6 square, and now Magnus takes on f4 with his rook. Tomaszewski, feeling some pressure because there's ideas of rook f1 and rook takes f6 floating in the air, decides a queen exchange will help his position. He plays knight to e4, but Magnus proves the exchange of queens does not help the position. He takes on e4, black takes the queen off, and of course some forced exchanges here, and we reach this position, and now look at what Magnus has done. He's left black with this bishop on b7. Now, this bishop, we noted earlier on, is a bad piece. It's still a bad piece. It doesn't have anywhere stable it can move to. It's blocked in by its own pawn. If it comes to a6, it doesn't have anywhere to attack on that file. And it's a bit loose, as we're going to see. It's loose to an attack. So all these exchanges and little tactical sequences White has done has gone to prove this bishop is bad. Brilliant positional play. Magnus now thinks about his pieces. His knight is very good, so you don't need to move that. The rook on h4 is okay, but the rook on d1, that can move into a better square. So he takes on c5, and now rook d7. The bishop, nowhere to escape to. If bishop d5, c4 comes, trapping that bishop. If the bishop goes to a6, well, you'd lose the pawn on e4, so you have to defend the bishop. Rook to b8, and now another thing we can learn from, very clever move coming up. Magnus realizing what black's next idea is, he's basically thinking, and this is something again we can learn from, what can black move in this position? Let's go through it one by one, and this is something we need to do. Think about our opponent's moves more in order to become better players. Well, the rook on f8 can't move because we'll win the f7 pawn, so we've got to cancel that one out. The king clearly can't move. The rook on b8 can't move because we'd lose the bishop. Black can't really move any pawns. He can't move the pawn on f7 because then white would play knight to g6 and rook h8 checkmate. If he moves the pawn on g5, it will just weaken his king. So he can't really do anything. The only move black has up his sleeve is a bishop c8 move, and then rook takes b2. So we've got to stop this idea, and very simply, b3 stops everything, and black is getting into a position of zugzwang where he can't move anything at all. Every move loses something. Bishop c8 now would lose the a pawn, and you don't want to be a pawn down against Magnus. So the game finished a5, and now rook c7, getting ready to pick off some pawns. a4, black is helpless. He still can't move any of his pieces. Magnus simply takes that pawn. The bishop goes to a8 with some dream of moving the rook in with counterplay. Magnus just pushes that pawn. Rook to b7, trying to exchange off that active rook on c7. But now the second pawn is gone. Rook takes c5. Rook a7, black so passive. And after knight to c4, Tomaszewski resigned, 2 pawns down. That knight is coming in to b6, and well, for someone of Magnus's strength, this is an easily winning position. Maybe even rook to h5, creating checkmate ideas, could be a consideration here. But a lovely game there. And again, the opening is, you know, if you fancy playing, let's go back and have a look. The London in a more positional way, then you can certainly consider playing it in the way that Magnus Carlsen did here. First with h3, and then once you've done your normal developing moves, as we see here, just bring your pieces, your rooks into the center. In order to do this, you've got to make sure your opponent's doing nothing active. White does that here. And then we see a sure sign of why Magnus is such a strong player. He makes some, should we say, out-of-the-box exchanges. And he does this all in order to leave this bishop on b7. He combines this with some great tactical ideas of rook to f1. Maybe black should have taken the pawn and defended, because his position was bad anyway. And then later on, after more pieces get exchanged, we see that a culmination of his plan is that he has left black with this bad piece. So there's a lot we can all learn from that game. One of the best positional games from my perspective of 2016. And obviously that will help us learn more about the London system as well. Hello and welcome to my fifth video on the London system. And this video is in the range of, I want to teach you this very solid and, should we say, perfect opening for the lazy player in as simple as way as possible. So this little series is aiming to do that, give you a very good weapon with the white pieces, an opening that you don't need to, let's say, spend too much effort on. If you watch these videos, you'll be very well prepared. Now, what we're going to do, have a look at in this next video is the second type of setup that black can play against the London system. There's really three different setups black can do after the moves d4 and bishop to f4. Now, so far, we've looked at all setups with d5, pretty much. I mean, of course, there's always more we can do. And if these videos become popular and you'd like more videos at the end of the sequence, I can try to answer your questions in future ones. So please leave comments. I do look at them and I will try to answer your questions. If it takes a video to do so, perfect. So the second kind of setups black can go for are ones where after we play bishop to f4, black plays g6. And this is what this video and the next video will concentrate on. And if black is the type of player who plays the King's Indian defense, so with bishop g7 and castles, or if black is the type of player who plays the Grunfeld with d5, or even the Benoni, he might be tempted to play g6. Now, against this move, I'm going to recommend to you guys a slightly different setup to what we've seen in the previous videos. Now, of course, you can do your c3, e3, all this kind of stuff, which we've looked at, but it doesn't have the same bite. Why doesn't the setup have the same bite? Well, structurally, because black has played g6, when we move our bishop to d3, which is part of our development, our bishop is simply blocked out. It won't have the same firepower against h7 as it did before. So trying to attack with this idea is just a lot less effective. And the main move is to try to do this kind of thing and play in that way. But I'm going to suggest another setup to you. And my first rule I'd like you to remember against g6 is to play knight to c3. And I think this is a very tricky move for black to deal with, because this knight to c3 move already asks black questions. So only against g6 do you play knight to c3. Why? Because I want to play e4 given a chance. And if black is not paying attention here and plays a move like bishop to g7, which he might do an autopilot, I think white gets a very nice game with e4. We'll look at this in a future video. A lot of people have mentioned to me this looks like a perk opening, but there are some distinct differences with this. Yes, it is really a perk setup, but in the perk, black will normally play d6 earlier on, and that means that he might be able to punish the move bishop f4 with an early e5. This is not possible here, so there's some slight differences. And after knight to c3, bishop g7 will simply run into this e4 move, and as I said, we'll look at this later on. But first of all, let's have a look at what I consider black's best reply. Black's best reply, in my eyes, is d5 now. And by playing d5, black is aiming to stop you from going e4. And now the game takes a different kind of turn to what we've looked at, as I mentioned before, because the difference is, to the previous games, black's played g6, we've put our knight on c3. So how are we going to try to get an aggressive game against g6? Well, I think I found the perfect setup. First of all, we play e3, and we're only completing half of our pyramid in this setup. Only half a pyramid, because our knight is on the other side of the pyramid here. And after e3, the most natural move, of course, is bishop g7. This is a move black is going to have to play at some point. And now, well, those of you who know me well, you might be shouting, Harry, Harry, Harry the H-pawn, Harry the H-pawn. And a little rule I have is, as you may well know, as soon as I'm able to nibble away at the fianchetto position of my opponent, I can do so. H4, Let's hear you cheer for Harry. The brave soldier marches on. And the idea of this is to simply play h5 and attack. Now, I'm going to say a little rule here. In the main game, we're looking at black castles straight away. And as soon as he castles, this, in my eyes, is not the best move. We can play h5. And we'll have a look at this a bit later on. So as a rule, you can even sacrifice an h5 when black has castled. Now, if black doesn't castle, the move h5 immediately is not as strong, because after maybe knight takes h5, if we try sacrificing the exchange on this square, our opponent's king is not in as much danger because it's not as near to our open h-file. So if black castles, we play h5 immediately. Against other moves, we can just play more subtly. So what other options has black got? Well, knight b d7 is a blunder. It's simply a blunder because we can go knight b5. And there's no way that black can, in a good way, stop knight takes c7 check. His knight can't go to a6 anymore, which it could do before. So you can't do that move. Against c5, and I've had this myself, and this is a very normal move, trying to start an attack in the center. I wouldn't take that pawn. I never like giving up the top of my pyramid. I never like giving up the top of my pyramid. I'm not keen on that. But a great way to play against c5 when black has not castled, and I think c5 in actual fact may be a blunder, not a big blunder, a slight error, is knight b5. And this works so much better when black has played c5. Why? Why is this? Well, the point is, against knight b5, when black hasn't castled, the only way to stop knight c7 check is by going knight to a6. And now that black has played c5, he can no longer play c6, kicking our knight away. So in this position, we've really misplaced black's pieces. Knight is fantastic. And now we just need to secure the positioning of our knight. And I had a game quite recently where I played in this position a4, and this just secures the positioning of my knight. My opponent played bishop to f5, and now I went back to what we looked at in the first couple of videos, the pyramid setup with c3, and I really think white has a fantastic position here. The knight on a6 cannot move. The rook on a8 can't move. We take the pawn on a7, and our knight and bishop paralyze black's queenside. The game I had continued castles. Now I could go h5 here, but another rule to bear in mind is if you don't want to sacrifice of h5, just prepare it. Bishop to e2. And this move, bishop to e2, now prepares h5 when I can take with a bishop if black ever captures there, maybe even g4 as well. My opponent played h5, stopping those ideas, and now I simply develop my last piece, knight to f3. That piece is heading to the normal square in the London system e5. My opponent played a good move. He tried to make that a bit more difficult, knight to g4. I went knight to e5 anyway. My opponent captured. I took with a pawn, queen d7, and now a super aggressive idea here, and the point behind my play, rook g1. And I've delayed castling in order to play g4. And after queen e6, I played g4, and there was a capture on g4, and lots of the pieces came off here. And the key thing about this position is I have great play because I'm going to play h5 next. So in all, I really think if we go back, and we're just really concentrating on the opening more than anything at the moment, if we go back to the position after h4, as a rule, if black plays c5 and he hasn't castled, knight to b5 is a very good move because you paralyze black's queen side, then you can concentrate on the king side. Now, other moves, if black doesn't do anything here, we are going to try to move our knight into e5. So that's another thing to remember. That's the ideal square for it. I would probably first go bishop to e2 in order to try to play h5. But these are our developing moves. Bishop e2 here. And remember, the bishop's not as good on d3 anymore as in the first videos. This is key because we're not really attacking anymore. The bishop is better on e2 because it supports h5. So really, there's not too much to remember. If black stops you playing h5, you try to bring your knight to e5, continue. If black plays c5, we go knight to b5, and we just develop. Now, in the main game, black did castle, and this leads to fantastic attacking chances for white here. White in this position played h5, and after the move h5, black took on h5. Maybe black should have played c5 here, but then we would just take on g6, and you can see we've got an open h-file for our attack. So something like knight to f3 here, and we can exchange off dark square bishops and continue attacking in this type of position. So h5 played, knight takes h5, and now because black has castled, rook takes h5. And this gives up the exchange, but after queen takes h5, in my eyes, white has a winning game here already, because white has such easy play. The bishop is coming to d3, threatening checkmate on h7. The knight is coming into the game, again, pressurizing h7. Once we've developed our bishop and knight, we can castle queenside, and our rook can come to h1, again, threatening h7. And I've had this in a number of games myself now, and I've won a lot of times with this opening. And black has tried a number of defensive setups. Now, in the main game, black played f5, and this was aiming to block up the bishop. And let's just see what white played now. White played a very clever move. Queen to h2. Now, this creates a threat, and it also sidesteps one of black's ideas. Black will really need to bring his knight to f6 to defend h7, because we've seen how weak that pawn can become. And when we play queen c2, we sidestep this idea, and we also just attack c7. And actually, the game was over very quickly here, because black played c6, and now white played bishop c7 first. Clever idea, because this stops the black queen ever coming out to the queen side. When the queen moved, just bishop takes b8, and white's got one apiece over the last couple of moves, so he's got a winning position. So already black's gone completely wrong. So f5, maybe not the best defensive move. Now, on the internet, in some games I've tried, I've had knight to c6 here. And let me just show you how quickly white's initiative can gain in momentum here. Well, we develop and create threats. Bishop to d3, developing and creating a checkmate threat. So now black has to play this move anyway, f5. And here, well, in actual fact, you can go queen h2 and win the pawn on c7. But I've always thought now that black's knight can never get to f6, I might as well continue my attack. Knight to f3. And one game I had continued bishop to e6, but this was a blunder because now my opponent forgot about my main idea, knight to g5, threatening the bishop, threatening checkmate on h7. Had my opponent played a better move than bishop e6, let's say something like e6, I'd have just castled kingside with the idea of rook h1. And I've had this kind of thing before. For example, now there's really hard to stop rook h1. And what does black do here? It's pretty helpless. I mean, if queen e8, of course we avoid swapping queens. Now we can go queen h2, always a good square. And we've got rook h1 coming. And even a good move is g4. g4, a key lever, trying to open up that bishop on d3. In this particular variation, our bishop is good on d3 because the pawn on g6 has been removed earlier on. So, just to recap there, the main idea against this g6 move, meet g6 with knight c3. If you can play e4, play e4. If black plays d5, we're going for an e3 move first. We play e3 first because it allows our bishop and queen more development. And after bishop g7, now this h4 idea. If black is not paying attention and he castles, we continue with this h5 and a grand attack occurs. If black does pay attention to this and play something like h5, we bring our knight into the e5 square. If black tries to counterattack with c5, he allows this good positional idea of knight b5, forcing black's knight to the rim of the board, to a bad square of the board, and again, we get a good game. So this is my way of playing against the London system. I think it's a nice way of playing, and I hope it will bring you lots of victories. And there'll be more videos of this as we go along. I have looked at these ideas in my own YouTube channel as well. You can check them out there. There are some crossovers, but for the premium videos here, I've gone into more detail. So hopefully explaining things in a lot deeper way. So please leave comments below, and thank you for watching the video. We're getting near the end of my series on the London system now, and this is video number 6. And in this video, let's just move to maybe a critical moment and one of the rules I really want you guys to remember from this particular video. And we're going to dive into the position after black has just played the move bishop g4 on move 7. Now, with the setup you see here, black has allowed us to play e4 and d4. And this resembles a kind of perk-like structure. And later on, we'll have a look how we get to this particular position. But a couple of rules I want you to remember is try to stop black from playing e5. This is rule number 1. And with the move bishop g4, you can see that black is trying to gain control of the e5 square by pressurizing the knight on f3. The knight on f3 is controlling that square at the moment. So the first thing we want to do is try and stop black from playing this move e5. So in this particular game, white played a very clever move now, queen to e3. And this is a very clever move because it releases our rook against the black queen. So if black tries e5, we simply capture on e5 and we'll win a pawn. We've stopped e5 from being played. And this game that we're going to have a look at in more detail in a second between Mamedov and Grishchuk continued knight to d7, black fighting for the e5 move. He will eventually get it in, but we're going to make it as difficult as possible for him to do that. How do we stop him again? Bishop g5. And this move is a very crafty move because it misplaces the queen. And after queen e8, the move played by Grishchuk, we now come to the second rule I want you to remember, and that is swap off dark square bishops. This gives you a great attacking chance. And the last thing, when black does play e5, I think the move we should aim to play against this move is always at some point pawn takes e5. And these are really the 3 basic rules of this video I want you to learn. But now for premium viewers on chess.com and subscribers, we'll have a look at how we got to this position and talk about things in more detail. So let's go back to move 1 now. So this is now, like I say, the penultimate video in the London system. So you're getting near completion. You'll be ready to play this very exciting and interesting opening, perfect opening for lazy people, very soon. And in this video, we're concentrating on the setup after d4, knight to f6, and we're always playing bishop to f4 in these positions, and now g6. So again, like the previous video, we're sticking with setups where black tries like the King's Indian defense, the Grunfeld defense, openings like this. What is the rule you should remember after g6? Well, the rule that I'm creating is after g6, we go knight to c3. We don't play this against other moves, only against g6. And now what we're really concentrating on is if black allows us to play the move e4. In the last videos, we looked at d5 here, which I think is a superior move. I think d5 is superior because it cuts across our intended plan. But a lot of players on the black side, I find this is a very common mistake. They won't be looking at your moves and they'll be playing on autopilot, meaning they're not really thinking about what you're doing, and they allow you to get your setup in. And if your opponent does play an autopilot, well, you can see Grischuk, one of the best players in the world, allows this setup from white, and he gets crushed in this game. After the very common move, bishop g7, it allows us to play e4, getting 2 pawns in the center of the board. And this is why we moved our knight to c3. It supports this strong center. And we have some very simple and very dangerous attacking plans from this position. Now, first of all, this position may resemble a perk. It does resemble a perk, but it has some distinct differences. In the perk, bishop to f4 is not really a common move. But now, just to show you what I mean by this, the perk is an opening where black plays g6 and bishop g7 against e4. There are some subtle differences. So I just want to show you these differences so you understand this position at a deeper level. After e4, to get the perk, black either has to go d6 or g6. Black can't go knight to f6 because that's the Alekhine. That would allow e5. Now, if black plays the move g6, we can go d4, bishop g7. And after we go knight to c3 in this position, again, black does not play knight to f6 here because this is always met by e5. In the perk, black plays the move d6. Now, the subtle difference here is you can see that the knight is still on the g8 square. So if we try to put our bishop on f4 now, this is actually a little bit different to what we're looking at. Why is it different? Because the knight is not on f6, so the knight is not blocking the bishop. And that bishop now has more control on the e5 square. So in this position, in actual fact, I don't like bishop to f4 because black can try to arrange the move e5. Remember, this is a move we're trying to stop in very simple fashion. Maybe he can even play it straight away here. But I also like a move along the lines of knight d7. And he's going to play e5 next. And when he does, that pawn break will attack our bishop and we lose the tempo. Now let's compare this to what we're playing. We're playing after bishop f4, g6, e4. And only now does black play d6. The difference is it's a lot harder for black to play e5. So this is an important thing to realize. Okay, so what should we do here? What are our plans? Well, we've got to combine our own plans with stopping our enemies' plans as well. Now, our own plans is very simple. We want to go queen d2 and castle queenside. Let's play aggressively. It's much more fun that way. And once we've done that, as I said earlier, we want to stop e5, always remember that move, or make it difficult for black to play that move. But my basic plan is queen d2, castles queenside, h4, h5, take on g6, open up the h-file, checkmate, thank you very much, job done, easy, easy peasy. That's our plan. So, for example, queen d2. Let's just see how this could play out. Now, again, if black is half asleep here, and plays a move like castles kingside, we should be rubbing our hands in joy because now we can simply go castles queenside, and I believe our attack as white is extremely strong. We're going to go bishop to h6 and just push Harry up the board. Come on, Harry. So, for example, let's say here black doesn't play, which I consider the best move, knight to c6. I think this is correct. But let's say he plays something slow like c6. Well, let's just get on with the attack. We can either go bishop h6 first or h4. I'd probably go bishop h6 first because this stops black playing the move h5. It blocks that pawn in. If we go h4 first, maybe black can consider h5 himself. So in this kind of position, we should just attack. I'm just going to show you the standard attacking plan. Bishop to h6. Okay, maybe black goes b5. And again, when your opponent plays a move in chess, you've got to see what his idea is. His idea is to go b4 and take on e4. We should stop that. 2 ways of doing so. We can either go bishop d3 to defend our pawn or f3. I think they're both very decent. Let's say f3. And now, well, here, if something along the lines of knight b d7, h4. And just look how quickly this attack is going to come. Let's say black plays knight b6. These are maybe not the best moves from black, but I just want to demonstrate your plan. Harry 5. And already this is probably winning for white. If knight takes h5, this is such a typical idea. Rook takes h5, pawn takes rook, queen g5, checkmate, next move. Very powerful. And if black doesn't play this, what else can black do here? Well, let's say he plays a move like a5, just to demonstrate this point of this attack. At the right moment, we're going to exchange on g7, exchange on g6, and bring our queen into h6, maybe even now. So bishop takes g7, king takes, pawn takes g6, probably f takes is forced, queen h6 check, the king has to move, and now there's only one piece defending h7, e5. So this is our general attacking plan if black just falls asleep and he doesn't really do anything to stop our ideas. And this is something I believe you'll get a lot of. Queen d2, castles, and checkmate. Very simple. So if black plays passively, do remember that plan. Now, Grischuk, again, we know he's one of the strongest players in the world, played knight to c6 here. And this is a much better move, in my opinion, because at least black is trying to do something in the center. It's a lot quicker than those other slow plans we just looked at. Now here, I would simply go castles queenside, because we are at the moment stopping the move e5, because we take on e5 and we have this almighty pressure along the d file. Now, ex-FIDE world champion Ponomaryov defeated Maxime Legrov with knight to f3. And this is a very decent move at some point. And you could play in this fashion with the idea after bishop g4 of just going d5. And I think this is a very simple way of playing. And the point here is after knight b8, knight d4. And we have a very pleasant position. But I actually prefer to meet knight to c6 with castles queenside, because it fits into our strategy a lot better. Now, what can black do here? Well, black really needs to try and play e5. Now, there's no tactics with knight takes d4. This is actually a move that a grandmaster played against me in a 3-minute game, which was shocking. And after queen takes d4, e5, I think he had a horrible realization that I could simply go bishop takes e5, and I've just won a piece. And he had to resign here because, again, we see the power of having this d file. I don't think that grandmaster was very happy. So black can't rely on any tactics like this. Grischuk castle kingside. And here, the move I'd recommend now, and I, as a rule, would do this when black plays knight to c6. Bishop h6 is playable, and you might want to experiment with this idea as we saw before, but I just want to stop black's plan first. There's no rush to get our good plan in of checkmate. We want to stop black from breaking out. So bishop h6 is okay, but a very logical move is to develop a piece, what can be wrong with that, and control the e5 square. And the move knight to f3 is very logical, very simple, and there's nothing wrong with the simple moves, controlling this e5 square. And again, black can't play e5 because we have too many pieces on that square. What can black do? Well, bishop g4 looks like the only logical move, developing the final piece, and again, trying to play e5. And now we see the position we started with. We're trying to stop e5. We don't need to rush with bishop h6. Let's open our rook against the queen. So queen e3. This stops e5 because we take on e5. And now you can see this discovered attack against the queen. It was my dad who once told me that you can never go wrong with lining up your rook against your opponent's queen, because at some moment things might open up to your advantage. So queen e3 is a very clever move, a very subtle move, and it's worth pointing out that we're keeping this double power so we can play bishop h6 later on. Now, Grischuk really struggling to find a plan here as black. I want to point out one more thing as well. If black ever takes on f3, I would always take with the g-pawn, doubling my own pawns. Now, why would I do this? Well, number one is I'm going to attack with h4, h5 at some point. So in this kind of structure, I have a g file I might want to attack along. That could help me. And in actual fact, double pawns, like I say, can be a strength. And the pawn on f3 supports the pawn on e4. And this could be very useful. So that's another little rule to bear in mind. But after queen e3, let's just see how the game went, because it demonstrates all these ideas perfectly. Knight d7. So black insisting on playing e5. And as we saw, very crafty move now from white, bishop g5, making that e-pawn, trying to glue it to the board. And again, given time, white will, if I was white here, I'd probably play h3, force the exchange, and then push my h-pawn very slowly up the board. I may even just play quietly and develop my bishop on f1. There's no rush here. Black, on the other hand, is cramped, is struggling for a plan. He played queen e8, so his e-pawn can move, but now he loses control of the c7 square. So now we go back to one of the first ideas I demonstrated to you guys. Bishop h6. It's nearly always a good idea to get rid of black's dark square bishop because he loses control of his king side. And he loses really a good protector for his king and a good attacker against your king. So a great exchange. Here, Grishchuk decided to take on f3. Remember the rule, we take with a pawn. And now, eventually, he got his e5 move in. Another little rule, I'm trying to bring out a lot of rules here, but hopefully you remember most of them. When black does play e5, if black eventually gets this move in, there's a simple way for you to deal with this. And I always propose in these positions that you capture on e5. Now, it looks very natural, instead of capturing, to go pawn to d5 to gain space and kick this knight away on c6. But this is the kind of thing that black might want, because you close the position down. On the other hand, I want to open up the position. This pawn structure here is locked. Maybe black can go into d4 as well, but later on he's going to play f5 and start typical counterplay on that area of the board. So as a rule, once you've made it very hard for black to play e5, that's a good way of playing, obviously. But once he does play e5, you should take on e5. And now, in this position, what does black recapture with? Well, if he recaptures with his pawn, I think we start our typical attack with Harry 4. Off we go, h4. Maybe even knight d5 was a good move there as well. Lots of tempting moves. Grishchuk instead decided to take with the queen on e5, but now a very strong move, knight to d5. And this leaves black in an awful predicament because we are threatening to capture the pawn on c7, but also we're threatening to play f4. Note these powerful double pawns, pushing the queen away, and that will weaken the long diagonal. Again, note how swapping off the dark square bishops has helped us achieve this goal. So if black does defend the c-pawn with something like rook c8, we would simply go f4. Where does the queen go? It hasn't got a good square. And there's a lot of tempting moves here. I'd be tempted to play a move like queen to c3 check. And now I could use both of my pawns by going f3. And here, very nice position. f5's coming next. I have a ready-made attack here. And I think black is probably close to losing in this position. So the game continued, knight to f6. But here, Mamedov just simply played knight takes c7, and his knight came back, and he's won a free pawn. And, of course, that's going to be enough to win the game. And he went on to win the game, especially at this level. So what do we have to remember? Let's go over the key points. Well, the key points are, when g6 is played, you play knight to c3. If you're able to, you should play e4. This is a key idea. And then once you've done this, you aim to castle queenside, queen d2, castles queenside. And whilst you're continuing with your plan of bishop h6 and h4, if black plays knight to c6, you're trying to stop e5. If he doesn't play knight to c6, I'd be more in a rush as white to play bishop h6 and checkmate. But here, just stop e5, as we're doing. Make it difficult for e5 to be played. Make it more difficult. When the timing's right, swap off those dark square bishops, and you get a fantastic attacking game. So I hope you enjoyed that video. There's only one more video in the London system to go. I mean, obviously, if you guys want more in-depth look at it, I can make some more videos for you, but I also don't want to overcomplicate things. You know, it's a simple opening, and I want us to be lazy. Seven opening videos is enough. Until next time, goodbye.